Well, thank you very much for such a stimulating opening session. We're going to start now with a series of panels, and the remainder of the day we'll be presenting panels on a range of different topic areas. This particular one will be looking at provincial cultural policy, and Western Canada is our primary focus. And I welcome Jeremy Morgan and Sylvia Blake. And I'm just going to give a very quick introduction to both of them and then turn the mic over to them. Sylvia Blake is a doctoral researcher at Simon Fraser University School of Communication, where she holds a Joseph Armand Bombardier doctoral scholarship, excuse me, and the CanWest Global Graduate Fellowship in Communications. Her research traces the evolution of the media diversity principle and seeks policy tools to support diversity within Canada and globally in the context of evolving media technologies, which we've just been discussing, industry globalization and trade liberalization. Jeremy Morgan is a familiar face to some of us, maybe many of us in the room. Jeremy's been working in the cultural sector for almost 4 decades in Nova Scotia and in Saskatchewan. Since 1988, he has been employed variously at the Saskatchewan Council of Cultural Organizations, Wanuskewin Heritage Park, the Saskatchewan Arts Board, and the Mackenzie Art Gallery. And since 2010, he has maintained an arts consultancy in a variety of areas, including strategic planning, governance, organizational development. And I believe that Jeremy quite recently has also been a fellow with the Johnson-Shoyama School of Public Policy. So we're going to start first with Sylvia.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me here today. I was the organizer for the Vancouver iteration of this event, so it's really nice to be here. I also want to give a thank you and a shout out to my colleagues at the Center for Research on Policy and Culture and Communities, Catherine Murray, Alison Beale, and Duncan Lowe, and their comments are reflected also in my presentation today. So to start off with, diversity is a very slippery policy objective. Part of the trouble is that the concept of diversity has very broad support from those who often don't agree about much else. From large firms to small artists working alone, everyone thinks diversity is a good thing. But there's much less agreement about what exactly it is diversity means and what policies should be put in place to support it domestically and globally. On the screen, I've listed a few ways diversity has been conceptualized and operationalized. There are likely other ways besides these. Crucially, they go beyond questions of trade and industry competitiveness and the economy. Also, some of these goals conflict, and those supporting various varieties of diversity often speak at cross purposes. A question I would pose to the room to bear in mind today then is, what exactly does diversity mean? How is it operationalized? And crucially, how is it practiced in the interests of justice, inclusion, or in the interest of specific policy or political goals? I'll turn now to the BC context. Now, these are the first 5 images that came up when I Google image searched BC culture. I myself am a transplant to BC, having been born and raised in Ontario. And I often think back to my days before I moved out here and my conception of what exactly culture was in the West. In BC, our housing prices are really, really high, and they're getting higher every day. There are also a lot of trees, and over generations, BCers have become very skilled in cutting them down. And the news more recently talk about BC's 20 proposed LNG plants, concern about pipelines, and other issues relating to natural resources. There's no doubt about it, BC is a site of struggle. To roughly quote our book publisher, Scott McIntyre of the publisher Douglas and McIntyre, BC is a province predicated on chopping it down, digging it up, and shipping it out. But what is less known is that British Columbia is home to more artists per capita than any other province. We have the 3rd largest cultural GDP in Canada behind Ontario and Quebec. And culture makes up about 33% of the BC economy, offering over 81,000 jobs, again, just behind Ontario and Quebec. Interestingly, responsibility for arts and culture has also been devolved to municipalities to a greater extent in BC than elsewhere in the country. It is a trailblazer in the Creative Cities Network, with Vancouver leading the charge at Expo 86 and beyond, and that photo there is from Expo 86. But provincially, BC's approach to culture is based in neoliberal ideological underpinnings, and provincial per capita spending is the lowest in Canada. If we remove spending on public libraries from the equation, BC spends around $40 per capita on culture, a far cry from Ontario's funding of around $94 per capita. Even more crucially in today's discussion, the province is making little headway towards improving its support for diverse cultural expressions, with the exception of some glimmers of hope and new approaches to Indigenous arts and culture. This is a breakdown of the funding structure for how we support culture in BC. One of the large arms is Creative BC, which is in charge of our tax program for film. It is also in charge of the newly minted BC Music Fund to the tune of about $15 million. And generally it supports business, investment, and anyone who's thinking of investing in BC creatively. There's also some community gaming grants which are administered through the province, and those are largely go to not-for-profits. And finally, there's the BC Arts Council, and there's an autonomous arm of the BC Arts Council that provides grants for Indigenous art, and there's the regular grants program. Other players not listed here, the Alliance for Arts and Culture, which is our lobby, and very, very importantly, private and community foundations such as the Vancouver Foundation. Overall, BC's focus by far has been on harnessing the economic potential of transnational cultural industries. BC is sold as a spectacular and economical setting for screen industries, with a highly skilled and largely self-employed cultural workforce, and as a gateway to international capital, particularly from the Asia-Pacific region. The province's goal of making cultural industries into key economic drivers has led to a focus on tax incentives to stimulate foreign investment in screen industries, and about 80% of this is foreign. Last year, BC taxpayers spent about $500 million on tax credits to the film industry, up from an average of $182 million between 2007 and 2012, as the province struggles in its race to the bottom against Toronto and Montreal. I should note that the province did announce this week that it will be decreasing tax incentives slightly to the tune of 1.5% for visual effects tax credits and 5% for regular film tax credits, citing Canada's low dollar and the specific attributes of Vancouver as reason for believing that our industry is strong enough with lower tax credits. While the BC Liberals have proudly announced a balanced budget for the 4th year running, the budget of the BC Arts Council remains stagnant at around $24 million, an amount that some commentators claim will only support around half of the expected funding applications this year. Notably absent from the budget speech this year was any mention of arts and culture at all. In the BC arts and culture scene, there is therefore a heavy reliance on self-earning, individualistic entrepreneurial ventures bolstered by sustainable, autonomous, nonprofit foundations such as the Vancouver Foundation and support from municipalities. Now, what we're here to discuss today, the UNESCO Convention. BCers often argue that cultural policy and other federal initiatives end at the Rockies. Unsurprisingly then, the CDCE has been more or less invisible in BC, and the province has done little to respect the spirit of the convention. BC has not introduced legislation to promote minority expression like in Nova Scotia, or introduced legislation protecting the special status of the artist as you have in Saskatchewan. BC residents are higher than average cultural participants across cultural activities. However, numbers are consistently lower among minority and Aboriginal populations. A recent study by Hill Strategies showed that attendance at art galleries, theaters, music events, and cultural festivals was around 11% lower for visual minorities and Aboriginal peoples than their white counterparts. Yet there are some signs of hope, particularly in BC's approving approach to Indigenous cultural expressions. Over the last decades, BC has gone from a politics of cultural assimilation to one that at least somewhat embraces difference. The first People's Cultural Council was established in 1990 to support the revitalization of Aboriginal languages, art, and culture in BC. The FPCC is arm's length from government and from the BC Arts Council, allowing for relative autonomy, although it operates on a shoestring budget of about $4 million per year. And another interesting development, BC is moving towards an authenticity mark for Indigenous culture, for Indigenous products and services, following the Cowichan Valley Knitters controversy in the 2010 Olympics. However, there's still work to be done in protecting and promoting Indigenous cultural expressions. The province stringently avoids any founding culture language in describing its First Peoples, and Aboriginal rights are generally not entrenched in the province's cultural policy. I'm going to end now with some thoughts looking forward. Moving forward, BC and the rest of Canada require better ways to ground the spirit of the CDCE across levels of government, including voice for creators and improved capacity for intergovernmental decision-making. This is an interesting time to be having this discussion in the wake of Mr. Lee's announcement of the sweeping upcoming cultural policy reform. Now is the time to act. There is a desperate need for a new national arts organization to take up the mantle of the Canadian Conference for the Arts. I say new not to belittle the work done by the CCA in its time, but in the recognition that this lobby needs to be relevant across Canada in the way that the CCA never was. Perhaps this requires an innovative new model. One approach might be to rotate the lobby's national headquarters to different areas across country every 5 years to provide fresh regional perspectives and ensure it is relevant across the country. Regardless of the format of such an initiative, one thing seems clear. Without a national lobby, our interventions will go nowhere. And for BC to buy in, it will need to feel that it is included as a full partner. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sylvia. And now, Jeremy.
I've reverted to handwritten notes. I hope that's not a sign of my deterioration as a management consultant. Thanks very much. And Isabel, thank you for doing this today, and Charles as well. I think this speaks to something that I'd like to mention as I make my remarks. I particularly want to thank you for your comments about the land we are on. I thought that was just eloquent and meaningful and should be built into our ways of being and thinking as we exist here. There are 3 points I think I'd like to make. There may be others that will emerge, but one is the precarious status of cultural policy in this province, and some of the issues around that, and my thought that we should be looking at policy renewal after 6 years, 7 years of our cultural policy. I can hear you groan and say no more of this, but I think we do need to address it. When you start to look again at the cultural policy, you realize that the first enthusiasms we may or may not have had in 2009-10 were, I suspect, and I'm guilty of this myself, somewhat misplaced. I think we need to have much greater engagement, which we see today, around policy development. It cannot be cannot be owned by a department of government. It cannot be the voice of a very controlled process. One of the features of today, I think, is the engagement of the academy, and I think that's critical. For the first time in my memory, we're actually dealing with larger pieces of thinking. The Declaration on Indigenous Rights of Indigenous People, is emerging particularly through the TRC, in a way that it did not emerge through the Royal Commission, chaired by George Erasmus. We have this particular convention, and we also have the Convention on Intangible Heritage as well, which was featured in another Academy partnership with the community, with Heritage Saskatchewan, recently through Johnson-Shoyama. And I just want to mention, I guess, the sense that to me is, we've been a divided community in various ways for too long. And I think finally, it seems to me the community is not divided. It can become whole and become a real voice for cultural development and diversity. The other piece is the secrecy of institutions, is I think a real barrier to serious cultural policy development and implementation. Lack of transparency, the need that institutions seem to have to I was going to say to conceal, certainly to restrict information, as if we were looking at world secrets, the secrets of the bomb or something like that. In fact, most of what we protect in institutions, and I've been part of that for a long time, is absolutely inconsequential in its state. We give ourselves far too much importance in administrative and management positions. There are some things, fairly enough, that should be kept close to the organization, but most things are, throw them out there and see what happens. And I can say this now because I have no one to report to anymore, except clients, I guess, and I have to be careful with that. Cultural policy in Saskatchewan has been created over many years by a number of acts. Most of them are not connected in many ways. We have the Arts Board Act, we have the Act for the Lotteries, we have the Heritage Foundation Act, we have the Creative Saskatchewan Act. And I just want to point out, with no malice of forethought, today's paper, which reveals that spin-offs from culture in Saskatchewan are declining. And so this comes from the owners of the National Post. We know it must be true. But it is important, I think, that we engage these pieces, and we are not engaging them, or haven't been able to very well over the last many years. There have been lots of efforts over the years to create cultural policy in this province. The last effort, I would point out, it originated with this university. It originated with Rose Olfert and Simon Wassine in what was then SIP, the Saskatchewan Institute for Public Policy. They did a background paper that went to the government, which was then used as the basis for cultural policy development rationale for it. You can only judge how that policy was written, how it emerged, and fundamentally how it was implemented. And I looked through the 2014 annual report of the department, and I saw no mention, I may have just been cursory in my view, of the cultural policy. It's as if somehow it is not being acknowledged. So I believe we need policy renewal, and I think it's as simple as that. And policy renewal, that's the product not of a very, I think, perhaps naive or perfunctory process in a way, although lots of time was spent, but rather policy renewal is based upon this kind of discussion by the people here in this room, and people who perhaps don't give a hoot about cultural policy, but do care about the lives they live and their access to resources. So Johnson-Shoyama, SIP, Humanities Research Unit, this university, University of Regina, First Nations University, and others are critical, I think, to the development of a serious and robust cultural policy in this province. The issues that I'm concerned about as I look around are particularly arm's length, is the reluctance of people to get up on their hind legs and speak about problems within the province, within the development, delivery of culture. And the film tax credit's got a lot of attention. Maybe we forget that that decision 2 to 3 years after the cultural policy, which extolled the benefits of the creative industries. So I did, when Lou referred to my time at Johnson-Shoyama as a Deacon Baker Fellow, I looked through the Massey Commission, and I didn't read every page of it, but I read a lot of it. And there's about 1,000 pages, I think. One page which was devoted to the indigenous arts, which was really tourist-based arts. My point in this is we have never nationally or locally addressed those issues as important single issues rather than tacked on to our ways of doing things. Canada Council, I think, has responsibility for this. I don't expect there'll be a Canada Council renewal, policy renewal, but I do take exception to the great man theory of cultural policy development and funding, which seems to be the case right now with the council. I don't think that one person should be driving it in the way that it seems to have been driven. That's my point. Again, cultural policy renewal, inclusive and in highly sort of developed discussion towards that end, and the relaxation of the either timidity, insecurity, caution of cultural, and I include universities in this, management and administration. So That's my point. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Now we open the floor to yourselves to ask questions or make comments, share opinions. And if you could use the microphone, if it's not too difficult for you to get over there.
Jeremy, I was just wondering, what year was the cultural policy for the province passed?
It would have probably been in 2009 or 10. The minister's comments were Dustin Duncan was the minister in the first iteration of the written version. It's signed in 2010.
Okay.
Marnie would probably, or some 2010? Yeah. So that's six. Pride of Saskatchewan, 6 years ago.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions or comments? Well, I'll just, oh, sorry, yes. No, please, go ahead. Well, I wanted to take us back to the film industry. It's very interesting how we have two quite different, seemingly, approaches in our two provinces with varying outcomes. Is that just my perception, or is that a reality?
I don't know as much about what it's been done in Saskatchewan. Can you debrief a little bit?
I think, Jeremy, that's you.
Yeah, for some years, this province, along with a number of other provinces, had a film tax credit, and then some secondary sort of bits and pieces deeming for people who came from Los Angeles and were deemed essential and Saskatchewan people for the benefit of the tax credit. This was a weakness, I think, in that program. But several years ago, I think it was announced in 2012, there are people with better memories than I in this room. It was decided that film tax credit was essentially an inappropriate subsidy to a certain industry, and it was canceled, wound down. It doesn't exist anymore. The government then developed something called Creative Saskatchewan, which, in my view, was largely to service the commercial music industries, but that's it. There's still some money going to film, either from Tourism Saskatchewan for Brent Butt's films, or for well, that did happen, at least for one, and the other piece is support through Creative Saskatchewan for films, for film development, videos, and such.
And in British Columbia, anyway, the film has sort of been where it's at. This is a big part of what you might consider our piecemeal cultural policy in the province. And it does center around discourse about the economy and about jobs. And there is some question about how many of the jobs are being brought in from other places, and how many people are being brought in from other places, and how many domestic jobs are there, and is this the best use of our taxpayer money to subsidize a specific industry, as it sounds like you've had the same question in Saskatchewan. And the government has lowered the credits a little bit. I don't see that as moving away necessarily from the industry. It's quite significant. They've invested lots of money in sound studios, and Vancouver is actually now the #1 location in the world for visual effects. We have the Sony Visual Effects studio that's moved in. So it doesn't look like it's going anywhere. Yeah, I guess that's...
I would say that part of the decisions affecting the Saskatchewan government's decisions were I think the somewhat artificial position that some in the industry took, that this was a business and industry. It had not much to do with culture. In fact, a good deal of these projects were started in the early days with money from the lottery system. But this division of culture and industry, I think, was a real mistake by the industry, as it's called, and I think ended up without sort of cultural leverage being brought to bear. Culture may create jobs, but culture creates community, as Sask Culture is proud to say, and I think that's what was lost in the film industry discussion, almost from the get-go. It seemed to me, anyway.
Yes.
Yeah, just a number of thoughts. As we build this day with Isabel and her group, we were thinking of, make this action-oriented and recommendation-oriented. So I think I really like the fact that you both came with suggestions and ways to move forward, and I invite everyone to think as we come to the close of the day to establish a list of possible items for action, and possibly as we also seek to summarize the day's sort of key points, keep those in mind and eventually share with the organizers so we can have minutes and a trace of this discussion. The other thought is that this conference series started, in 2014. It's been running in Quebec City, Ottawa, Montreal, Moncton, Vancouver, and this is the last on our list in terms of funding. We're running out of steam, and it's just as the Canadian Commission for UNESCO is about to hire a new general secretary, and Minister Joly is embarking. You can see, the alignment of planets. Is there anything that we can suggest to pursue this conversation further on either specific, themes across provinces and so on? And two last, and again quickly, on the national platform, I'd be very interested to hear from you people what would be the focus, because you're possibly right to say it might have addressed a certain view of culture, maybe not a broader view of culture. What would be the broader view of culture? Can we agree on some sense and meaning of that to define what the national platform could be addressing? And what would be the entry point, if there is one, to seek for a federal provincial conversation, engaging a provincial minister through the leadership of the Liberal in Ottawa? And is there something we can do to open the deadlock or break the deadlock? Thanks.
Thank you. We'll take one more question and then we'll be breaking.
Well, hopefully not a rhetorical one. So, Jeremy, you made reference to arm's length. Mm-hmm. And at the Arts Alliance's Arts Congress last week, by the admission of the interim CEO of Creative Saskatchewan is not an arm's length agency, and that's certainly underscored by the language in the Creative Saskatchewan Act. So, and at least the perception that the Saskatchewan Arts Board continues to operate with an arm's length relationship to the provincial government. So from a policy standpoint, what's your sense that is sustainable in the longer term, that the two key provincial funders, leaving Sask Culture to the side, using tax dollars, the two key tax-based funders in the province operate on these quite different relationships to the provincial government?
Yeah, thank you. I was told not that long ago by a very senior person in the department that there is really no such thing as arm's length. We've got the power and you don't. It's kind of, I think, thinking. We are government and you are not. The long tradition with the Saskatchewan Arts Board has been some form of arm's length. I've always viewed this as a relationship. It's a set of maneuvers, and it's reading their entrails as well as our own, if that's not an ugly kind of concept. But I think government, this current government, the Sask Party government, has from the very beginning started to take on programming and more specific roles that former governments, both Conservative and NDP, did not. And there's a lot of sort of rhetoric around that. But what it does tell me is that the current government, and this may become, it's maybe where we are today, leaving the current Liberal government for a while alone, we may see more of this rather than less. We may see, as Patrick Close used to say, arm's length is a function of the hand around the neck. And these are all ugly things to think about, but there is, Patrick is now in Alberta actually, happily for him, but there is a real issue, I think, around arm's length and our ability as a community, set of communities to negotiate that, not in a kind of a rigid way, but in a clever, politically smart way. It's hard for the agencies to do it. It's as you can imagine, the government does in fact, in the end, controls the purse. It controls the board composition. And in the case of Creative Saskatchewan, it controls the appointment of the CEO. So arm's length, the more you get to that, and the more there is this sense of we are in power and you are not, or we are the government, or we are the senior civil service and you are not, we're going to exercise our control. And so command and control is it seems to be, and had Mr. Harper stayed in power, I think we would have seen more of that too. It's a distressing issue, and one that I still try to figure out where I think it can go, but this is maybe an issue for this body to address, because it's critical to the issues we're speaking of. It's absolutely essential. Anyway.
Sylvia, do you have a quick addition to that?
I think Jeremy's summed it up for me. Thank you.
Okay, well, please. Oh, I think we really need to move on, and just to not interfere too much with the next panel that we're already moving into at this moment. So please join me in thanking our presenters again, Sylvia Blake, Jeremy Morgan.